I'd like to get started, and before we get started, I just have a few things that I'd like to go over. The first is that I sent around an email a little while back, a few days ago, as a member of our faculty on Monday, a lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry named Jeremy Richmond committed suicide. And Jeremy and his wife, Jennifer, were parents of a girl named Aviella, their daughter, who was murdered in the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting. And that was a devastating loss for them, as you can imagine. And they took that pain and that frustration, anger, and they turned it into a positive thing, which was a foundation called the Aviella Foundation, which was created to study and prevent gun violence and including suicide. And Jennifer and Jeremy went around the country. They educated people. They lobbied the government. They raised funds to support research on violence and in suicide. And things seem to be going extremely well. But on Monday, Jeremy took his own life. And it's particularly poignant that someone who was fighting against it would then take his own life in that way. Terrible tragedy for the family, a loss for the field. Jeremy was involved in consulting and within advising the department, and his foundation was going to was on track to probably fund some research in the department, which I hope will still take place. But personally, it's a terrible tragedy and a lesson about the long-term impact of violence in our society on people. Just a terribly painful one. A second issue that is coming up in Connecticut right now is that there will be a bill, there's a bill under review related to psychologist prescribing of psychotropic medications. And the bill would require that psychologists do coursework, equivalent of a master's degree, plus have 2 weeks of preceptorship and 6 months of clinical supervision. So some people feel that that's an inadequate preparation for psychopharmacology prescription. Other people feel that it's an adequate preparation and that it will help to address a need in society because there's a shortage of people to prescribe a medication for psychiatric patients. Yale University is refining its position on this and will probably today submit testimony. And I would encourage those of you who are supportive of psychologists prescribing or against psychologists prescribing to also submit your input on this bill. It's just one thing, that none of you are empowered to speak on behalf of Yale University. You should only speak on behalf of yourselves. And there's been some confusion as some people who are on the faculty in other departments have submitted testimony as if they were representing the position of Yale University. So when you submit your testimony, please make clear that you are just representing your own views. I'm trying to think if I've been up here since the match day of the residents. I don't think I have. So let me just say that the psychiatry match was just a spectacular, incredible match. We're going to have yet another incredible group of young people joining the department for the psychiatry residency program. We're thrilled that it's a very diverse group and extraordinarily talented, very accomplished already, and really pleased that this group is joining. And I say this every year, I can't say it enough, that the reason these people are coming to Yale is not because we took them to Barcelona for dinner. It's because of the work that everybody here puts in, the psychiatry residents in particular, the faculty who volunteer their time and who go the extra mile to make people understand that this is a welcoming community and an exciting one. And so that's why we're good at getting such wonderful people in the department, and we're just thrilled. So thank all of you for doing that. In terms of grand rounds, next week, on the 5th of April, faculty member, professor, adjunct professor, professor in our department, Zafra Cooper, who is an expert in eating disorders, but many of you may not know her, is one of the international experts in the development and implementation of cognitive behavioral therapies for eating disorders, is going to be giving grand rounds. And the topic is a transdiagnostic approach to psychological treatment for eating disorders, theory, research, and future directions. This is really important because eating disorders are an area that we'd like to develop more in the department, and Zafra is one of the key people helping us to move in that direction. The following week, the 12th of April, is the Sidney Blatt Lecture, and the lecturer is Drew Weston from Emory, and Sid Blatt was the head of psychology at Yale, the section of psychology and psychiatry, for 40 years. That's a really incredible legacy. And the Blatt family endowed this lectureship, and so the lecture is about thinking clinically about political discourse, neural networks, narratives, and emotions. Should be very interesting. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Stephanie O'Malley, who will introduce our grand round speaker today.
Good morning. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. John Torous, who's here from the Department of Psychiatry at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center at Harvard Medical School, where he is a psychiatrist and the director of digital psychiatry, the Division of Digital Psychiatry. Dr. Torous has a background in electrical engineering and computer sciences and received an undergraduate degree in that field from UC Berkeley before attending medical school at the University of California, San Diego. He completed his psychiatry residence, a fellowship in clinical informatics, and a master's degree in biomedical informatics at Harvard. In case you were wondering what MBI stood for, biomedical informatics. So he's thought it was going to be an MS, but it's an MBI. Sounds like you could be somebody taking on aliens with that, but anyway. So his research, though, is really so timely. He's looking at digital mental health and especially the use of smartphones toward improving outcomes in schizophrenia. And an index of his reputation nationally is that he's the incoming chair for the American Psychiatric Association's Health IT Committee, web editor for JAMA Psychiatry, and editor of the online journal JMIR Mental Health. So I'd like to go ahead and invite him to the podium. I know there will be a lot of questions and discussion afterwards, so I want to give him time to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you guys for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Before we start, we actually also take our residents to Barcelona for recruitment, so now I'm gonna have to be careful what we're doing in Boston. So I'm going to be speaking on digital psychiatry technology. I think the key word in this title is early. And I think for any residents in the audience or residents watching, this talk is really geared towards you because there's a lot of opportunities for residents or junior faculty to do some interesting work that will hopefully have a large impact. So a conflict of interest, I'll talk briefly about an investigator-initiated study we're doing with Abilify. My site, there's no data to report because we don't have much. But if there's one thing you remember, it's this cartoon. It says, will I ever get over my smartphone addiction? And the other penguin says there's an app for that. So that may be a good representation of where the field is. But we're going to quickly talk about the state of smartphones and mental health, just very quickly. What is digital phenotyping, this word you may or may not have heard about that you're going to hear more about? How do we kind of help patients, help ourselves say, what is a good mental health app? What is a good digital health tool? What is one that we want to avoid? And what does informed consent mean in the digital age? What is going on with things like Facebook right now, and to the point where Facebook is sending people to the emergency department for suicidal thoughts? So we'll cover that at the very end. So there's a lot happening in the digital mental health space. I'm going to focus more on smartphones, a little bit on wearables, but realizing that this is a very rapidly expanding area. There's a lot of different technologies, and people are kind of looking at this in whole different ways. There's a company in San Francisco I'm not affiliated with called Achille that's going to announce its FDA approval for a video game for ADHD pretty soon. So all of this is kind of happening at different levels, but we're going to focus more on the smartphone aspect today. So the number of mental health apps, does anyone want to take a guess at how many of these things are out there? Let's include mindfulness, meditation, prescription apps, Android and Apple. Any guesses? So 500, 1,000, 10,000. So I like 10,000. That's the number that Laura Roberts and I at Stanford guesstimated by looking at industry reports. You really had to guesstimate that number. It's always changing. The number of FDA-approved apps is a little bit less. It's 1. And this is something from a company in Boston I'm not affiliated called Pear Therapeutics. They got approval for an app for substance abuse, but really their FDA approval was to take CBT on a computer, get it FDA approved, and then market it on a smartphone. So we don't really know what this one means or is. What's interesting is there's a report that came out that looked at industry studies, basically saying, what are the industry studies doing? And what they showed was there's a lot of interest in industry funding this work. But if you look at mental health, they're kind of all orange. And you say, what does that mean that they're all orange? And basically, they're not looking at clinical effectiveness. A lot of these studies are happening, which is good. But if you look at our field especially, they're not assessing perhaps what all of us in this room and all of us listening care about is clinical effectiveness. And the fact that this is kind of a 2019 survey tells us that something is perhaps going in an interesting direction. But you can also see that there's a lot of interest in mental health. Depression is right below it, and not surprisingly, it's also orange as well. So an interesting paper to read. That said, there's always these great headlines. This is one I took last month. It says, mood forecasting tech could help stop bad moods even before they strike. It's pretty exciting. And then you have these headlines. This was from the summer. Our good friends in the NHS across the ocean. NHS to launch first internet addiction clinic. So maybe not as positive. And then this was last month. Instagram bans suicidal or self-harm related content after outrage following death of 14-year-old UK girl. So I think just in looking at these kind of 3 headlines that are all happening now, you kind of see there's a whole spectrum of excitement, potential, concern that really is evolving. And I think keeping that context for this talk and this whole space is important because we're living in this right now. It's changing as we speak. So a review paper that we did a couple years ago is we said, I work at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, so not the Connecticut Mental Health Center, but we basically did a meta-analysis looking into literature of do patients with psychosis own phones? And what we showed is there used to be a digital divide. This is the general population, this would be people with psychosis. But as phones have got cheaper and more accessible, everyone can own them. There's nothing about having a serious mental illness that means you don't want to use a phone. So as this digital divide has kind of closed, people have access to phones and technology. Some of the folks I treat, I actually upgraded my phone because my patients were making fun of me. They said, John, you have this old phone and we have this really new iPhone that like looks at your face and unlocks it. And they said, how can you like claim to do digital psychiatry, but you don't even like have the phone? So I got shamed into upgrading, but point being, many, many patients have this technology, and if they don't, they will. It's cheaper and cheaper. You can go to Walmart and you can be a proud owner of a smartphone for $49. So, and what's interesting, what do people do with those phones? And there's always the idea, if you have a phone, does that mean you're going to use a mental health app like this small study? If you have access to technology, doesn't mean that you want to kind of use it to improve your mental health. And we did a very simple survey study at 2 of our clinics this year in Boston. The private clinic is our university clinic at Beth Israel. The state clinic is the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. And black is, do you own a smartphone? We stratified by age. And you can see younger people own a smartphone. Red is, have you ever downloaded an app? And green is, have you ever downloaded a mental health app? And you can imagine blue is that mental health app still on your phone? So you can see the assumption is just because you have a phone is good, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And you can see that it's about maybe 10% have a mental health app on their phone. Are they meaningfully using it today is a whole different question that we'll try to get to. But certainly, I'm sure that blue, all these numbers will go up with time. But it's interesting that people are downloading these apps, right? They're looking at them. They are downloading, they're looking at them, but they're not really sticking with them. And I think that's an interesting thing we'll do. We actually got permission to look at people's phones with them. The IRB made us put the phone in airplane mode to make sure people wouldn't get an incoming text message and we would learn something inappropriate. But we put people's phones into airplane mode and we counted what apps are on your phone if you have schizophrenia at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. And we found that the #1 category of apps, not surprisingly, was games, social networking, music, and navigation. It's not too surprising. I'd argue almost most people in this room have that. Mental health apps doesn't show up, we're way down here. We were behind books. And not like Kindle app. It's, I guess, kind of Kindle, where your phone turns into a book and you go, let me read and scroll pages. So patients, at least our patients, were not kind of finding mental health apps per se. The broader question is, what is a mental health app? Does Facebook become a mental health app because you want to build social connections, right? Do you end up using an exercise app as something? So I think, but what we classically label as a mental health app may not be what people are finding. That said, some patients really do get excited about it. I think our patients at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center know that we really like technology in our group. And we had one patient who needed to increase his dose of an antipsychotic medication. He was having more auditory hallucinations. And without telling us, he basically said, well, if they're going to increase my dose, I want to make sure that my hallucinations go down. I want to see this is actually effective. So he found a little kind of counter app on his phone, and he said, every time I kind of am going to hear a voice, I'm going to unlock my phone and press +1. But he said, that's really inconvenient. So he just bought a tally counter. So he bought himself this tally counter. He said, well, it's a little bit clunky to kind of have a tally counter and walk around. So he went to Amazon and he bought a digital tally counter. And he came to one of our appointments one day and said, your group is building all these apps and things, but I think I've built something better. I said, okay, what is it? And he said, this is my schizophrenia tracker, and this is his figure, not mine. And he said, this is the count of how many hallucinations I've had. This is time, and these are kind of doses of the medication. And he said, it's interesting, as the medication dose has gone up, I'm seeing that I'm having less auditory hallucinations. he said, maybe this does work. And he said he's actually still using it today because he finds it so helpful for himself. And clearly this is not, the typical person does not want to click a tally counter almost 300 times in a day. So this is not going to work for everyone. But it's interesting that, I mean, people are, I said, we hear a lot about patients with diabetes kind of self-experimenting, making artificial pancreases. I think you have to say, our patients are really curious too. They're trying new stuff. I think if they're in an environment where they feel they can share it and tell you, you may be surprised kind of what they're doing with technology or what pieces they're trying to put together for this. So I think this kind of gets into what are these apps doing, what can we collect, what is this digital phenotyping? So these phones can do a lot more than, or just have a tally counter. You can certainly get self-report surveys, as we're going to talk about. On some phones, you can get call and text logs of people's permission. You can say how many outgoing and incoming calls did you get. You can learn about GPS of people's permission, what locations were they at, how long did they spend. You can get screen use data from people. With watches, you can kind of get heart rate. And you can imagine that, and if you have this kind of composite picture in real time of all this data that these phones are gathering, in some ways you have a digital biomarker that's dynamic. It's always changing. It's not just a one point in time. And that biomarker kind of evolves as people are moving through their daily life. And this is the research I'm going to tell you that we're working on. We've ended up building our own tool. It's free on the internet. You can download it, you can own it, you can make a business out of it, we don't care. The reason we've had to make our own tool is because there's a lot of issues of who owns the sensitive data, right? If you're collecting data on location that people are at, if you're collecting surveys where people are saying they're suicidal, where is that data going through? And we'll talk about that more later. But we've ended up building our own pretty simple tool that we're using with other universities. Well, really, they're just used it, and we don't have any role in it. But in essence, what we're doing is we're trying to look at physical activity via smartwatches, also data, symptom surveys, cognitive testing, but also environment. And the goal is, can we understand how symptoms are varied by activity and environment? We do care what your experience is, what you're feeling, but what's happening around that. And so we've been doing a lot of interesting research in patients with psychotic disorders, looking at even the influence of sleep. And this is kind of just an example of where we had one person who, as sleep kind of improved and got better, the symptoms of depression, anxiety, and psychosis got better. And we kind of all know that as our clinical intuition, but being able to show that to a patient kind of in a very simple way, that he could log on to a portal and see that, was interesting. Because I think a lot of times I give out a sleep hygiene handout and it ends up in the garbage can outside my office. More often than not, but again, telling people this is something you could be doing by just kind of simple tracking is interesting. And where it becomes very interesting is even something as simple as the PHQ-9, 9 questions about depression, question 9 about suicide. We did a small study of this where we had patients with depression in our clinic come in at day 0 and day 30. And we said, just use the app, only answer 9 questions a day, and tell us your PHQ-9 on the smartphone. And you can kind of see that that blue line is the average, a dark blue line, and it's higher. It was about 3 points higher on average. But those diamonds are when people report a thought of suicide of a 2 or 3 to the PHQ-9. And you get the sense that people are telling the app, I'm having thoughts of suicide. We had no one tell us in person for any subject that they were feeling suicidal face-to-face. So even when you're doing something as simple as self-report surveys, you're kind of capturing different information. People are telling the technology some things, they're telling the face-to-face clinician some things, and which is true is hard to know. Are people over-reporting to technology? Are they under-reporting to clinicians? But certainly it just raises the issue of any one-for-one translation is not that simple for kind of one of our most bread and butter simplest scales. And what we've been doing now for psychosis is that we have a lot of patients using our app. We can again ask people questions about psychotic symptoms, a kind of small version of BPRS, but we can almost cluster people into 4 clusters automatically. So each morning we can rerun this and say, longitudinally, that each one is one person, how many days they've been using it. We can say, are your symptoms a low average, and what is their variability? Because we're really worried about patients that have a high average and high variability. And again, this is not a complex clustering algorithm because we don't want black boxes. I want to know, why are these two folks down here, what makes me worried about them? They have a high average symptoms as running, and they have high variability. Where the folks in yellow have a low mean, and they have low variability. Perhaps they're more stable. And again, so you don't have, just by looking at active data surveys, right, self-report, you can begin to get some pretty interesting pictures of how populations are doing. And of course, phones can do a lot more than surveys. So this is for a different patient. We're asking survey questions, and on weekends, the person doesn't take any surveys, so I just block them out. But because it's on a phone, you can get how long they spent answering each question, right? You can also get that on a computer. We know when the button was clicked. We have a timestamp of kind of every interaction. When you take a paper pencil scale, you usually aren't watching kind of saying you spent 1 second on question 1, 2 on question 3. But on a phone, actually, that's kind of automatic. You get that data for, let's say, free. So this was kind of one patient doing a different study, and this was depressed. Width in this is kind of relatively how long he spent on each question relative to others. So this person actually pondered, am I depressed? More. Luckily for, it's hard to read up the self-harm, it was very narrow. He kind of quickly said no. And again, what does this data mean? I can't tell you today. Is this noise? Was it the fact that he was always on a bus when he answered that question? He was distracted. It doesn't mean it's clinically validated useful data, but it's interesting to say that even on self-report, we can kind of begin to look at it in new ways. But of course, phones do even more than screen touches. This was an article I did for an engineering magazine where we said, what are all the sensors on the phone and how could they potentially be useful towards behavioral health? And the story behind this is every year at the American Psychiatric Association meeting, the CIA has a booth. So one year I went up to CIA and said, you know, I'm doing smartphone research and I think you guys have a lot of data. And they said, what? I said, well, you must be capturing all these interesting things from people's phones. And they said, sir, we don't collect data from US citizens. And I said, there must be a few, right? And they said, this conversation is over. So that was, but if you guys go to the APA in San Francisco, you can try to ask the CIA too. But they must have a lot of this data, and I'm sure I've got myself on some watch lists for their comments. But point being, you can imagine that if the phone knows where you are, that's interesting data from a behavioral health point of view to some extent, right? If the phone knows that John sent 100 text messages and no one wanted to text me back, it's interesting. Again, we can't say what it clinically means, but there's some nugget of perhaps of information in there. So with Jay Pionella at the Harvard School of Public Health, there's an app called BeWe that's also open source. You can run it, it's free, that we've got permission to install this on patients with schizophrenia. And this is what the passive data looks like kind of from behind the scenes. So we collect GPS, and we can kind of turn it into these metrics. We can collect call and text logs and turn it into these metrics. We can push people surveys, and the red dot means you took the survey or not. And this was a patient who was pretty compliant. They kept their GPS on. It's just a heat map of what data we got. And this is a different patient, and you can almost see just by looking at the quantity of data collected, how much, you almost see a different digital fingerprint for two different people. And what's interesting and a huge issue in the field talk about is, was this the fact that the person never was moving? They stayed at home for 4 days? Did they turn their GPS off? Did the phone kill the app in the background to try to save battery life? Why do we have this missing data, right? So we can't just assume that this is a crystal ball into behavior. And to give an example, whenever someone kind of says all these smartphone data, you want to say, what is the data quality? Let's actually look at the raw results. And this is for accelerometer for people in study. We asked the phone to give us one accelerometer reading every 10 seconds. So we should get 6 per minute, 60 minutes, 24 hours in a day. So we should get this many accelerometer readings from the phone per day. This person's phone said, no, you're going to get 1 data point. And this phone said, you're going to get bonus data. So on average, we are getting the data we expect. You can kind of see we're close, but there's a lot of missingness. And what's very interesting, as smartphones have kind of become optimized for battery life, that's what we all want as consumers, it becomes harder and harder in some ways to collect passive data because the operating system made by Apple or Android works to kind of shut down the passive data app. So I've never seen any passive data that has 100% kind of completeness. There's always going to be missing data, and I think that's always the first thing to just consider. And we actually tried in this paper to say, does the missing data actually predict something? Can the quality of data actually tell us about people's clinical symptoms? And our sample size was too small, so I won't go into it. The interesting result that we found is we worked with Ian Barnett, who's now at UPenn, and we said, using our data kind of from these data frames you've seen here, from kind of this digital data, what can we learn about relapse in patients with schizophrenia? This is a plot for one person, and the way that we decided to analyze the data, we said each person is their own control. So if I sign up for the study, for the first week, we collect these 3 metrics, which you've seen now, but the baseline is per person, it's within subject. Because the way I use my phone is very different than the way someone else uses their phone. We don't yet have a global digital signature for relapse. And then kind of like a GWAS, we set a threshold to control for multiple comparisons. Let's say we're collecting all this data. When would a value for mobility, for sociability, or self-reported outcomes be very different for you compared to when you signed up for the study when you were healthy enough to consent? And you can see on this data, the person had self-reported surveys that were very different for themselves, and it was a false positive. What's most interesting for this one person is about 2 weeks before relapse, something was slightly off in the sociability and mobility, and you can see the self-reported surveys had a lot more power. They were very different, but all 3 were kind of moving in the same direction, right? There were kind of these 3 anomalies, and the method here is anomaly detection. So it's fancier than outlier detection, but same idea. And you can imagine it's interpretable, right? You can kind of say it's interesting that all these domains are moving in the same direction. And this is what we use to go to the NIH and say, can we have funding to try to replicate this? This was in 17 people, and we didn't have too many relapses. So currently we're doing a larger study to say, does passive data with anomaly detection help us learn about relapse in psychotic disorders? And we use these 3 data streams. We've become interested in cognition as kind of another thing to add to anomaly detection. And the reason cognition is interesting is you can imagine we can make, let's call them cognitive in quote games, because a cognitive test translated onto a smartphone is not validated. It's different. It's not going to be the same score, but this is basically a trails test that we modified for the smartphone on our app. And when people play it, the data actually that we get looks like this. And we kind of model in a Cox proportional hazard model. If you think of some of those examples of kind of cancer studies where you look at mortality, and you can kind of learn something about the pattern of mortality. In this way, we can learn about how did you take the test? How did you actually follow the sequence? Where did you get stuck? How long did you spend on each level? So we're not actually measuring your score, we're measuring the metadata, the way you took the test is a different way. And there's a lot of room to develop new methods in analyzing data like that. But what's interesting is we're beginning to show that on a population level, we can show that people with schizophrenia take the test differently than healthy controls. So again, it's very early days, but you can imagine there's a lot of interesting data on how you take the test on the phone, and will that be a marker of changes in cognition? So it's still early, but it's certainly interesting, exciting research. We're beginning to kind of put all these data streams together and to say, well, if we can collect things around cognition for a person, we can collect steps, we can collect sleep, we can collect all these surveys. Can we learn how they're all moving together in time? Can we kind of build these very simple correlation matrices for patients? Will these actually be useful? And what we're starting now is, I'll get more to it later, a small digital clinic where we're seeing patients face to face. We're having them use our apps and technology and saying, we're not sure this data is correct. Does it match to your experience? It's a good way to start a discussion and say, you may not be sleeping as much as we want you to be sleeping. Your exercise pattern may not be right, but it also could be the phone is just wrong, right? So I think we have a very humble approach towards what the data is, but it's a good way to start a conversation. We're not going to say, because of a correlation matrix, we're changing your medicine. We're not at that point, but we're saying, hey, this is an interesting thing to bring up in the appointment and kind of begin to have a conversation around. There's also some really new data you can get from phones that I'd love to get your guys' input after on what you can do with it. This is power state. And by power state, I mean when you turn on your phone, the screen knows it went from off to on. We turn it off, it goes on to off. We can kind of capture phone sessions per day. So some people are basically spending a long time. The phone was on for an hour, probably watching YouTube. But most people are kind of, it's so dense, checking the phone hundreds of times per day. And does that tell us anything? What can you kind of get? Are people who are checking the phone a lot more anxious? Is it reflective of something else? Is it just noise? Are people checking the phone more connected, less connected? But you can kind of get this interesting kind of proxy of something, I'll say. It's new data. As we get more data, we're beginning to look at, can smartphone data help us predict future clinical states? I think this is still very early, so I won't go into detail. But you can imagine if you have all this data at time 0, you can say, how well can I predict what's going to happen at time 1? Because you do have GPS information with people's permission, you can also begin to look at the social determinants of mental health, which is interesting. You can quantify what all of us in this room and listening online know, is that certainly the social environment makes a difference. And this is a map from the census of Boston. There's social justice areas, which are areas each state says these are areas with less opportunities, less resources. So this was it for Boston, and we could actually begin to map out what social justice areas do our patients spend more or less time in. So we haven't really done the analysis, we just kind of were mapping up the plotting software to where our patients spend time, and we can say, this is interesting. We can actually now go advocate at a state level and say, hey, a lot of our patients are spending time in these neighborhoods or this. So again, very early towards it. You can also begin kind of saying, well, that's great, John. You can kind of detect all these things. You're beginning to move towards digital phenotyping. You can kind of find these anomalies. Then what do? You are just going to tell people you're not well. That's probably going to make people not feel great if your phone each morning says, sorry, you're not doing well. And we've realized we'd like to move towards offering some type of intervention. And we'll get to in the second part of the talk, realizing these smartphone interventions are not going to transform people's lives today. They're going to be augmenting. But we actually wrote to Wellcome Trust and said it would be interesting if we could kind of add on these pieces you don't see there. What can we offer people around medications, around sleep, that would be useful? And we said, theoretically, the potential of a phone, if it works in New Haven, it works in Boston, it should work in rural India too. That's the whole reason we're excited about this. It's scalable. We can take it. So Wellcome Trust recently funded us to kind of develop out more simple interventions, but then kind of take the work we have now and say, how can it work in a kind of transcultural way? How can it work in rural India, urban India, and Boston? So it'll be interesting what we learn. We also only have 2 years to do it, so we'll be very busy. And this is kind of the digital clinic model I said. I was saying at the dinner last night, we actually scheduled our first patient for a digital mental health clinic, and we were very excited. And he came in and said, wait, the front desk told me this is the clinic where you help me reduce screen time. And we said, oh no. We said, we're so sorry, sir. This is not the clinic where we want you to have less screen time. If anything, we're asking you to use your screen. And so our first clinic patient will be next week. But the idea is, if you can collect this data on an app, and again, someone has to want to do it, right? We're not going to force people to do this. That they have to be a willing party to it. Can we run simple algorithms? But can we actually have someone at staff looking at it? So can we kind of look at what their care looks like from a digital perspective and lens? But how do we deliver care where we don't kind of interfere with the therapeutic alliance between a patient and a clinician? The technology doesn't come between you. We're not forcing you to talk to the app first. It's not like when you're calling Amtrak and trying to book a ticket, you have to talk to that horrible chatbot to reach a person. So we're saying, how can you actually kind of use the app to collect information, but then it will facilitate a conversation that starts out the in-person visit. So I'm hoping next week, we called our patient actually and said, we want to confirm with you that we're here to help you use technology, not to reduce screen time. And the patient said, that sounds great. So I think we're in a good part for that. We've also actually started with our psychosis program is we realize a lot of patients do have access to phones, but they actually aren't sure how to use them towards their recovery. They may spend a lot of time on YouTube, watching videos, but they don't say, how do I fill a medicine online? How do I check my clinical visits? How do I even get ride sharing to go somewhere? There's a lot of things that we kind of take for granted using technology that some of our patients actually don't know and understand. And one thing that's been very informative in this work is kind of running these groups of patients where we teach them basic digital health tech literacy skills. And I said, we're developing a manual for it now that should be done next week we can share. So if anyone's kind of interested in taking your kind of outpatient groups, so we replaced a cooking group for our thing. So the cooking group was getting a little bit stale. It had gone on for years. And we said, maybe it's time to update this to kind of the digital health literacy group, so a different area of it. I think what's interesting when you do have all these digital signals and coming in, you begin to answer new questions. And this is our industry-funded study, which we don't have any results because it just started a couple weeks ago, but Otsuka got FDA approval in 2017 to embed a transmitter in every pill of Abilify. And certainly this brings up many different reactions, from cool to why and what's happening. But the thing that interested us, we said, this is the first time that we do know that a medication was taken, it was ingested. And if we now know that a medication was actually ingested, we can actually begin to model what happened using the smartphone data before. Was it a night that people got better sleep, they remembered to take their medicines? Was it a day when people traveled more, that they forgot to take their medicine? A lot of prior research on medication adherence has been keep a paper pencil log of when you took your medicine. Let's look at if you filled the medicine at CVS. We actually haven't really had a great gold standard, was the pill ingested? So we're not using it in a clinical context, it's with patients, but it's more in a research saying, can we build models to learn about when people do or don't take their medicine? So too early to say what the results are of it, it's still ongoing. But getting back to the over 10,000 mental health apps and work with the American Psychiatric Association, I kind of liken these apps to cargo ship containers. We know there's a lot of them. They're always coming and going. If you look for the same app in 6 months, it may be there, it may be gone. And it's kind of hard to peer deep inside of it and say, what's really in that container? It says it has this, but what is in it? And the question is, if a patient comes to you, if you want to recommend an app, what do you do? If someone says, should I use this? Or you read a story and they say, this app is the best thing since sliced bread. What do you do next? And there's a bunch of websites that kind of, this is a screenshot, says, these are apps for your mental health. You go, what are these things? So we did a project this summer where we like pyramids in our group, but we basically tried to code the top apps for bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, based on all these features. We said, does the app have surveys? Does it have clinical evidence? Is it on Apple? Is it on Android? Does it have a privacy policy? We did this giant matrix of kind of all these features. And we said, if we do some simple data-driven machine learning, can we kind of find an algorithm that the best mental health apps always have surveys and they give you a personalized response? They always get GPS and they give you a group. They always have this. And the only thing that we could kind of conclude from this paper was an app that's not good has not been updated in 180 days. Probably didn't need to do a complex analysis to figure out an app that the developer isn't keeping up is not good. But the point being, it's really hard to know what's a good or bad app. There's no magic formula that says look for these things. So work we've done with the American Psychiatric Association is saying, if we can't kind of say this is the magical best app, how do we help people think about making better decisions around apps? And getting back to the pyramid theme, we kind of have these 4 layers of risk, evidence, ease of use, and interoperability. I'm going to run through each of these 4 to kind of tell you how they make sense and kind of what they can do to guide you thinking about apps. The American Psychiatric Association did put this on their website. They put it as steps because they said, John, this pyramid is great, but it goes against the APA's corporate shape policy. And I said, I didn't know there's a corporate, this shape did not fit your corporate shape policy. And they said, steps, take it or lose it if you want it on the APA website. So I said, we'll take steps. So I'm hoping as the incoming chair of the APA's Health IT Committee, the pyramid's going to make a comeback. So that's my mission for the next year. But the reason that we kind of start with privacy and safety as the first thing when someone brings you an app is no one is actually peer reviewing what's on the iTunes store. This is actually the #2 app for schizophrenia as of last week. It's actually an action game. It's a horrible action game. It's Pong that you play, and the levels are sane, insane, and schizophrenic. It's stigmatizing, it's horrible, but that literally, if you type in schizophrenia, the #2 thing that comes back is that. And again, that's just wrong. This was an app from the UK that someone made of managing addictions. You can manage being right. You can manage collecting things. You can manage cocaine too. It's, again, someone probably had very good intentions. Adrenaline producing is useful for life. Certainly too much or too little is bad. But again, people are putting up stuff, and it can look okay, but when you kind of look closely, they're not all as blatant as the schizophrenia one. I like this one from the NHS in a sarcastic way. It says, help yourself by don't being admitted. Help the NHS save money. Don't go to the hospital. And then so I think the quality of many of these things is dubious. Where it also gets interesting is a lot of these, at least patients I've talked to say, well, I downloaded this app, it looked like a health app, so I assumed it's going to protect my privacy and confidentiality. And what happens is these apps kind of in the privacy policy say, no, just kidding. We're a health and wellness app. And because we're a health and wellness app, that's great because we don't fall under HIPAA or privacy protections. We're kind of like posting your data to social media publicly. And so we actually printed out all the privacy policies for apps for dementia to prove a point. And we read them all. It was actually really boring. But what we found was basically these privacy policies all say we're not going to protect your data. And they basically say, well, and somehow we're going to end up commercializing your data. And there's nothing wrong with that. If people understand that the price of an app is their data, that's fine. But when it gets buried in these privacy policies that are a college level to read, that's not right. And we actually have a paper coming out next month in JAMA Open, so it's not out yet, where we actually intercepted the traffic on these apps. We read the privacy policy, but we said, let's see if you're actually following your own advice in the privacy policy. Are you saying, if you say it, you don't share data, is that true? So we kind of followed the packets as they left the smartphone and said, where is the data going to? And the punchline is apps really aren't even following their own privacy policies. It's like me telling you guys, I promise you I eat all my vegetables every day, I exercise every day, it's great, I wrote it down on a piece of paper. And you go, well, that doesn't mean you do it. So we're actually, I think when this paper comes out, it'll be interesting, because we're kind of at a point where we're saying, how do we actually know what these apps are doing? We almost argue, you may want to assume that your data is quasi-public using these apps, because if they're not even listening to their own privacy policy, which is not great to start with, that's not a great thing. There was a wonderful article by the New York Times by a reporter, Natasha Singer, in December, where she actually showed with the weather app. You may have read this with the weather bug app. It was basically tracking you and selling your data to advertisers. And this was a picture the New York Times had of how much information the weather app had and how it was kind of following you. So that's kind of level one, is you just want to think of these things and be aware. And a patient may go, you know what, I'm a really private public person, I post all my data. This is great, I don't care, the app has no privacy, and that's fine. But as long as people are making an informed decision. So I don't think it's our job to say, no, don't use it. It's to say, let's figure out what is the safety around it and does it make sense for the person at hand. So there's no rule that says if you meet these criteria, yes, you should use it or no. But it's more, let's actually be transparent about what's happening and then let people decide. So this was a paper we actually looked at the evidence. This actually came out 2 days ago. And what we did is we looked at kind of the top most popular apps for anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, self-harm, substance abuse. And based on the claims that the app made in the iTunes store, we kind of said, what is the app telling people? And a lot of the apps were basically saying 64% or 40, using the scientific language, we are based on evidence. We are based on CBT. And then we said, well, how many of them actually have backed up those claims with with real science. How many have actually studied the thing on the app? And 1.4%. So what's happening is, and how this happens is the app says we're based on CBT. CBT is evidence-based. And you go, well, that's great, but does CBT actually work on your platform and your app? And the answer is, we don't know. It may. But certainly I think what the public is seeing is a picture that these apps are very scientific. And you go, well, we just don't know yet. But there's a lot of kind of misinformation towards it. We did 2 meta-analysis in 2017. We have to update them now, but we actually looked at RCTs for apps for anxiety and for depression. And we said, how well are these things working as interventions? And the effect size actually looks okay if you compare an app to a wait list. But as soon as you have a more appropriate control group, the effect size goes away. So as soon as the control group becomes app versus coloring is one study, app versus walking, the effect size quickly kind of plummets. It doesn't disappear. They're not harming people. They are helpful, but they're not going to be, these are small effect sizes, right? These are useful to augment and to extend care. These are not effect sizes, kind of, but if the control group is wrong, and I think what also makes these app studies really hard is, this was a really good study that was done at UW, and they were looking at this app that's going to get approval for ADHD in children for the video game. But they said, let's try it in depression. And they gave it to people with depression, and you can see kind of people got better. The PHQ-9 scores of time went down. And in the appendix, they were a really good research team. They kind of offered the data by adherence. Who never opened the app, read, who always used it optimally, and who sometimes used it. And what's really exciting is the people that never used it, read, they did the best. By literally keeping the phone in your pocket, you too can reduce your depression symptoms. That's amazing. This is a whole new paradigm, or something else. And so Headspace is an app I haven't used, but I got interested in it this summer. A different group put out this paper that looked at Headspace, and Headspace, to their credit, let this researcher build a placebo version of Headspace. And you say, what the heck is a placebo app? And what it was the same app. It had the same kind of funky cartoons. It had the same person narrating the mindfulness, but this time he talked about something that was just completely random. And they gave it to a small set of college students, so not perfectly powered, and they said, can you tell who has the fake mindfulness app and the real one? And the answer was no, nothing separated. So you imagine we kind of see here, wait list, appropriate control group, and you kind of go, wow, what is the placebo effect doing? And the truth is we don't know. Again, this is all happening, this was this summer this came out, so it's all kind of evolving as we speak. So we've talked about risk, we've talked about evidence. Ease of use, I think, really matters because even if the app makes sense, it has some clinical benefit, can people stick with it? Is it tolerable? Again, this is kind of getting toward, if you're going to say someone should do CBT, can they actually come to all the sessions? So if anything, we're just doing our normal clinical decision making, right? The risk benefits make sense, and can someone follow through? And PTSD Coach is a very good app. I recommend it to people. They've done great evidence. They're updating it. But they do have their thing. It's been downloaded over 100,000 times in 74 countries, which is really great. And to their credit, they put out research that showed that here's the 100,000 people that have downloaded iOS, less on Android, but how many people kind of returned 24 hours later? So they lost a large proportion of people. And so just downloading an app doesn't mean you're going to use it. And I think intuitively that makes sense, but you kind of see these metrics of this app has been downloaded, and you go, well, who's actually sticking with it? And to their credit, they have a lot of people sticking with it compared to other apps, but it's really hard to know if an app is usable or not. This is a paper we had come out in Psychiatric Services yesterday as well, and we actually set out to do a meta-analysis of usability of smartphone apps in mental health. And we said, what is a usable app? What do we know about it? And we actually couldn't do a meta-analysis because no one can agree on what is usable. Some studies are doing number of clicks you do, some are custom surveys, some are focus groups. There's no consensus on even what is a usable app. What's interesting about every paper we looked at in this study was all 40 of them said our app is very usable. And again, we know just from real world that people aren't really using them. So it just shows you that even kind of our usability studies, we have a lot to learn. So you can look at it as the glass half full or glass empty. There's tremendous opportunity to say, hey, let's think about what are the right metrics, what are the right ways that we evaluate these things, because right now we're in the early stages and the heterogeneity is so high in even the outcomes that you can't even compare two studies to each other. So that's kind of level 3. Level 4 gets to looking at, if we're using these apps, we really don't want to be siloing people's data, right? We're in an era where we want integrated mental health care. You don't want your diet app, your exercise app, your medication app, your therapy app, putting data into 4 different databases. No one can ever see it. Your psychiatrist, your therapist, your psychologist can never integrate it all together. You can't even put it together. We really want data to be kind of working, flowing together. So we really want people to be able to at least access their data. We certainly know it's very hard for apps. It's almost impossible for apps to send data into Epic right now. Epic is, if you're curious, there's the Epic App Orchard. It's a tongue twister to say. So Epic is trying to make a way for apps to integrate data into their app store. But it's very hard. So you want to say, if you're going to be using an app or recommending it, how is that data going to come back and make a clinical discussion with you? You really want to be facilitating you talking about something, right? It's strengthening your relationship with the patient. You're not just collecting data on steps for the point of it. You're saying, we're trying behavioral activation, and I want you to use this because I think the data is safe. There's some evidence that doing this makes sense. I think it's usable for you to do, and if you get to we're going to make a decision based on how many steps you took. It's not just we're siloing your data into a bucket. So for sake of time, I'll skip over that. But so it's a little bit abstract, this pyramid of what we're doing with kind of apps. A project we did at Cambridge Health Alliance is we kind of worked on using this kind of broad principles. And we kind of met with people at Cambridge Health Alliance, patients, prescribers, therapists, and we said, let's kind of pool all the apps we've heard patients using, apps that you've seen, apps that we're interested in. Let's think what criteria from the ones we just said make sense to you. And let's kind of run these apps through it. Let's figure out what matters to the population we're working with. Let's think what criteria matter. And what you can kind of do is you can almost, again, kind of filter things through and make what we kind of call a toolkit. You can say, here's what makes sense, but it's a time-limited toolkit because the apps change. So we're starting to call these, we're making the Spring 2019 edition now for Beth Israel. And the reason we call it Spring 2019 is we don't want people to look at it 3 years later and go, these are horrible apps, what happened? And we'll say, well, we can't, they're gonna change so quickly. But I think it is possible to kind of help people make better decisions about apps. You don't have to make people run through it. And again, with the American Psychiatric Association, I'm hoping we'll continue work on this next year to make it more hands-on, more accessible. We've written about this in World Psychiatry, trying to get some consensus kind of around these bases to say, can this kind of be a larger effort? And I realized too, there's other ways to think about apps. We have a paper that we recently wrote where we looked at 25 different app rating criteria. So there's many criteria to judge an app. And what we did is we just counted what are they each focusing on. And most app rating criteria focus on short-term usability. Most recommendations that people give around apps really derive around short-term usability. Does it look nice? Is it easy to start up? Is it easy to use? And I think that doesn't always work as well when we're dealing with chronic conditions. We want people to use these things for more than a day or two. So I think just looking at what other criteria are promoting kind of gives you some idea of why we're in partly this pickle, that we're really overemphasizing short-term usability, and you can see kind of privacy and security are not really the focus right now. So again, with this goal of the APA framework is to kind of say, hey, let's refocus what matters most. It's risk-benefit, it's tolerability, and it's data integration in a meaningful way. So this is the new version of the pyramid that we're going to try to get the APA to endorse as a pyramid. We'll see. It may be steps, and I'll come back and hang my head in shame. But I think the broader question is clearly this is a bigger issue going on. These apps are in this kind of ecosystem. Is the FDA going to come and rescue us? Maybe, maybe not. This is a slide from the FDA, not me. And this reflects the latest and greatest thinking from the FDA on how they're going to kind of change regulation around these apps. Because they too have realized this is kind of a chaotic situation to have this happening. And the FDA has proposed this pre-cert model where the FDA said, look, we cannot keep up with all the health apps out there. if we say have 10,000 in mental health, there could be up to 300,000 across all of health. And the FDA said, we have a solution. We're going to regulate the people who make the apps. We can't keep up with what they make, so let's go one step back and let's regulate the app makers. So if your Department of Psychiatry becomes a FDA-approved app maker of excellence, basically the FDA will streamline your app. So anything that Yale makes will kind of become FDA-approved off the bat in this model, and then real-world evidence will determine what happens next. It's an interesting model, but there's a lot of details you can imagine they're not fully worked out in this. The person who was championing this model, the FDA commissioner, resigned, I believe, 2 weeks ago. And Elizabeth Warren, our senator from Massachusetts, wrote a pretty sharp letter to the FDA in December saying, I don't understand this model. It puts too much kind of regulatory burden on technology developers, not on clinicians. So I don't know what the future of this is, but I think you're going to hear more about FDA pre-cert and what's happening. And I think the last 1 minute, I kind of want to cover perhaps not as exciting a side of all of this. And I learned about this when a reporter contacted me that Facebook actually is doing this suicide screening research now. So what will happen is if you're on Facebook and you're typing in the word suicide, noose, rope, Facebook is running natural language processing in the background, and they're automatically scoring it for risk. And if you score high enough, and I don't know what their algorithm is, someone looks at it. I don't know who that someone is. Are they a clinician or are they not? And that someone may call the police department and have the police come out to your house and do a safety check. And this happened in Massachusetts. Someone in Cape Cod, Facebook called one of the police departments, the county auditor, and said, you have to go to someone's house. There's a suicide that's about to happen. And the police said, thank you, Facebook, that happened 2 days ago. So their algorithm's not even correct. But they've actually rolled this out, and it's interesting to see this company kind of, again, taking on clearly what I would argue is a public mental health role. And we haven't had a patient at Beth Israel come in where it says, reason for admit, Facebook sent me here. But it's a very strange world, right, where we live, where theoretically there could be someone in the ED right now that was sent in because Facebook called the local police. And Facebook has said, we don't have to tell you our algorithm. We don't have to tell you who's reviewing this. As a clinicians, it's very unclear what's happening. And again, but they're a private company. So certainly interesting. We live in interesting times, right, where Facebook is doing this when we don't really know much about it. And recently, there was a headline that the FTC accused Facebook of revealing sensitive health information. So again, there's a lot of interesting parts happening. The MindStrong story in California is interesting and evolving. It's a company doing some very innovative work using touchscreens to predict mental health. And they got funding from the state of California. Stat News ran an interesting article, but what was very interesting is a local patient group in Northern California basically put out a bulletin saying, digital phenotyping we talked about, this is interesting. Why are we being asked to use this and partake on it if we're patients who are kind of county patients? What does it mean? What does it do? Where does our data go? So it's interesting that kind of patient groups are also saying, hey, we have questions. What's going on with this? So again, these are kind of things happening in real time. Again, this was January 1st, 2019. This was in the fall that the patient group, Access California, kind of said, what is this digital phenotyping? And I learned about it more so because they quoted one of our early articles. And I said, we wrote about it. We're not the ones monitoring you in California. But it's certainly interesting. So I think from the ethical point of view, we probably do need to be wary of these things because these are not great trends for kind of something that has so much potential to help the field, but to kind of see it being used in these ways is a little bit concerning. So with that, I'll say thank you. We have a large research team, and I said clearly this is a work of a lot of people. So thank you guys again. Questions, comments, complaints? Yes.
So first of all, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. One question that I always think about, I'm curious what you think about, is whether scientific research is too slow to keep up with the pace of technology. So thinking that okay, we create an app, and then after 20 years, we have 3 randomized clinical trials on it. But then after that time, people don't want to use it. It's just so old and out of date. And how do we conduct science in a way that keeps up with the rapid pace of technology, and so that we're not sort of constantly behind the pace of technology? And that makes sense.
I think that's a very good question. The idea being this field is evolving very rapidly. There is some Palm Pilot research still being published, but clearly, and because it takes a long time. If you wrote a decade ago and said, I'm going to do a 10-year study on using Palm Pilot to longitudinally monitor symptoms, you would be publishing now. And I think what's reached a turning point in this technology research is building a website used to be really hard. You kind of had to have an HTML programmer. You had to kind of have all this expert knowledge. We're approaching a point, I would say, now where building an app is still not trivial, but it's becoming a lot cheaper. It's almost becoming kind of like those drag and drop websites. So I would imagine in 12 months, we're getting a point where if you guys want to make a passive data app that's your own, you can have your own technology passive data app. If you want to have your own wearable integration, you can soon build the systems for very low cost as things become standardized. So I think in part, it's going to be easier for clinicians and researchers to play in this space because the barriers to entry are going down. I think it does raise a broader question. When you're funding these technology projects, they probably do need a little bit higher funding than they're getting initially. We don't need billions of dollars to build a great app, but you need more than, say, $50,000. So I think sometimes the traditional funding, we were talking about the dinner last night, it's close, but you need just a little bit more to kind of make your app at least look good. You can certainly prompt people and say, take a survey, but if it doesn't have that nice user interface, for $10,000, you may have kind of lost half your data. So I think it's an evolving topic, but I think as the research gets cheaper and open, it's certainly doable. Everything I talk about, our tools are online, they're free to use. And I think that's also a change in culture of there's going to be a lot more open source tools where you go online, you say, John's done interesting work, but really John's ideas are okay. I'm going to kind of take them this way and use those tools. And I think that's a really good trend that's happening as there'll be some open source software that actually is usable and that is good. Question to far back.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for the talk. I just wanted to I have a couple of questions regarding Facebook. So is there a financial motivation to Facebook? Is it going to be a financial motivation in the long term? And how is there any regulation thought process going? You know, they've had a lot of data breaches about this information being protected from insurance companies, for example, because I can see insurance companies being the financial partner for that.
Yeah.
So, or ad provider.
So it's a good question, kind of what is Facebook's motivation for jumping into the space? I don't think any of us know, or if people know, they're not saying. And Facebook has basically said, we don't know, put it that way. I don't know, and I'm not sure why Facebook is doing this or what their ultimate goal is. Certainly they are a company with a duty to return value to investors. They're not a public health department, and that certainly is concerning, but they have not kind of declared what the incentive is for them in this that I've seen. Question?
I guess kind of two things. One, I wonder about how Facebook is making this remotely accurate, given that, like, after the Cambridge Analytica breach, you could download the information Facebook had about you, and for most people, it was like comically wrong.
Yeah.
But also just with this culture of making apps that can track a lot of your personal data, is there a lot of thought into how to encourage people to use that helpfully? Because I think we all know, like, you know, like 80% of people who get a Fitbit end up like pacing back and forth across their living room. I must get more steps.
Yeah.
So, like, how do you kind of build into the app, encouraging people not to look at it every 3 seconds?
And I think partially that gets back to those groups we're running with patients with psychotic disorders now. We're actually teaching people in these kind of 4-week classes. We're saying, hey, let's learn about your phone use. Let's actually open up your phone and see how much screen time you had. And a lot of people, again, I think all of us in this room and listening may be a little bit more tech savvy in the general population, may kind of think about these things. I think a lot of times we actually do need to sit down and kind of help people level set and say, here's what's up, here's what's down, here's what we know could be helping and hurting. And we found with our patients, we even said, check for the presence of a privacy policy. It's hard to do a full evaluation of an app. Before you download something, just look if a privacy policy exists. Clearly that's not the be-all and end-all, but I think giving people kind of simple tips to start with actually goes a long way, because I think some people are you just don't think about these things. You say, well, they look like health things, so I'm going to use them like a health thing. But I don't think there's a great answer to it either. Question?
Yes, thank you. In your talk with the data app that you showed us,
Yeah.
your gamification design, did you include sticks and carrots? And if so, what were they?
So it's saying, did we add gamification in? So we did add a star system in. That said, what we found is people, if you give people extrinsic motivation to use an app via rewards, via stars, they will use it. But really, to kind of get the type of engagement we want it to be intrinsic, right? We want people to be using it because they're curious about their health and they're learning. So we found, at least in our own internal testing, is no one really cared that we had a spinner wheel or stars. We still have it. And the people that really used it were using the app because there was a question they were interested in. They wanted to say, how does my sleep impact my health? So that said, we're also not gamification experts either. We know, we've read a little bit about it, but certainly a complex world, and this world of micropayments is interesting. The one app that did get FDA approval for substance abuse actually pays you to go through each module. So they've kind of added on these kind of micropayments, and they kind of have gamification as well. But I think how do you get people to stick with these things is certainly very confusing. And the engagement thing has been hard. I think the first paper I read in kind of this digital mental health space, I think, Seth, you wrote it with Edward Tufte. And you guys wrote a paper looking a while ago, saying if we have electronic health records, how do we display data in a way that people care about and engage with? So you guys were writing this many, many years ago, and I think you proposed a brilliant system that still hasn't been implemented. So I think there's good ideas out there, but just they're not being implemented. Let's go there, then there.
Thanks. Fantastic talk. Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the future for integrating physiological data in these kind of work?
Yeah.
Heart rate variability, skin conductance, these kind of things.
Yep. So I think what we've learned is getting, with anything, syncing two things together, syncing a phone to an app, there's always going to be some loss of data, some technical difficulties that go together. That said, we're pretty excited to even just get step count and sleep. It's not the fanciest data, but certainly having objective measures of those basic things is nice because clinically we know how to integrate with them. We found that heart rate variability is not great on commercial. The Apple Watch doesn't yet really give you, at least the way we found, it's hard to actually calculate true heart rate variability from these commercial devices. That said, they're improving so rapidly that I wouldn't be surprised in 6 months there's some announcement from one of these companies that says we have a device that actually does get it to you. And so I think it's only going to get better, but today it's been tricky. And we've also found we have better luck estimating steps from the phone, which is not great because you can leave the phone at home, but people do stop wearing, I'm not wearing into many wearables I bought as a technophile, so people do stop wearing them.
Hey John, thanks for your talk, I really appreciated it. I had two questions. One, I was curious about the placebo effect and value. In that, if a lot of people are using these apps in the Headspace study was interesting in this regard, that what value are they getting at? What are the things that they're getting from these apps that maybe are not traditionally things that we look at in our mental health conceptualization? And the second one is I was interested about the global mental health work you mentioned. And if you guys are looking at digital phenotyping, and I can imagine that there is a lot in different cultures.
Yeah. So to start with the first, I'll start the second question and come back to it. So the digital phenotyping in different cultures, we are planning to kind of do digital phenotyping now in India and in Boston, but even learning about what is acceptability, what do people think of it, how do you present the data to people in different cultures, how do you tailor interventions or even notifications to be culturally appropriate is very difficult. I think, if anything, gathering the data in the technical part is relatively easy. That's a problem that you can solve with enough funding and enough good luck. I think the cultural part is tricky. I don't know if people have read our paper on global mental health, have they? That we wrote several years ago on kind of looking at in East Asia, kind of what can we learn about how could smartphones be useful, and kind of we said kind of if there's these large disasters happening, can smartphones help us learn about population responses? Who needs help? Who's being reached? So I think we only learned about the Wellcome Trust funding a couple days ago. So I think I'll reach out to you certainly. We'll talk more about this because you've been to all these places. And remind me I already forgot the first question.
The first question was about value.
Yes, a placebo, sorry. I think certainly the placebo, it's a part of mental health treatment. It's hard to deny it. I think it would be interesting to begin to quantify what makes a digital placebo. Is it the design? Is it knowing that there's a human on the other end of the app that you can connect to? Is it there's a social network surrounding it? I think we haven't even begun to quantify what are the elements that make it up, because clearly if we understand what increases your expectations in app will help you, we can begin to use that to our advantage. So it's not a negative thing. I think it's a negative thing when it's used to sell people something, to say you should be paying a monthly subscription fee for something that's not any different than anything else. But if we can design it, I think it'll be very interesting. One thing we built into our app that we haven't studied is we said, what if we just make the background color this horrible shade of red and say report your symptoms when the app is red, and then we take my favorite color of a nice calming blue and say report your symptoms. Would we actually get people, and then we kind of just A/B test it, would even background color change how people report symptoms? I have no idea, but it would be really fascinating to just kind of see that.
Last question, but I'll just comment. The
Okay.
tobacco company's been using things like that forever, so I'm sure these things would matter.
Yeah. Or one, sorry.
Do you want to end?
Yeah, no, you want to put your question? This would be the last one.
Or penultimate or whatever.
Okay, then we'll go one back there. Yeah.
So the issue of the low uptake. So the idea of a digital clinic that is built around engaging these apps
Yeah.
doesn't work if only 6% of the 10% of the patients that you're treating are actually getting the treatment. And so it seems like the design of a digital clinic has to have other ways of engaging patients so that a higher percentage of the patients are using these apps.
Yeah.
Have you thought about that engagement problem?
And partially we wonder, will the sentinel effect, the fact that they know they're going to come see me in a month and I want to talk about the data with them. It's not self-care, it's not kind of waiting for a chatbot to pop up and say good job. We think that the kind of fact that you know that someone asks you to do it, and you know that the decision making matters to you. Another thing we thought to kind of make that better is we've built our app to be customizable, that people can track their own things that matter to them. So there's some degree of customization. It's that you track the things that matter in your case. Everyone's not going to be doing the PHQ-9. So you kind of create your own custom questions. You have your own kind of version of the app that's specific to you and your needs. You know that your clinician wants to see the data. That's our kind of first pass at it. We'll also have these ideas of a digital navigator. Can we train up research assistants to kind of have some therapeutic engagement with patients to check in if things aren't going well? So can we kind of add a new person to the team? The trick of a digital navigator is adding new people adds new cost. So certainly I think the cost structure of this is also going to be interesting. The flip side, you can say, well, if people are they actually going to come to appointments because they're so engaged or kind of tracking symptoms, or we can have less no-shows. And the fact that we have less no-shows will that kind of make up for these cost issues. But I think it truly is something we're learning, and I think if anyone else wants to kind of run one concurrently, we're excited because it's a new thing to do. And I think we had one last question here, then I'll...
Actually, mine very similar, but a little bit opposite. So I really appreciate your talk on evidence base, and so that in the intervention space, there's some of these interventions that do have a lot of evidence, and rather than a digital clinic, what if there are clinicians and administrators here who want to start implementing these products in their current clinics? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think I think it's worth, if there's a tool that you trust, that you know the data, it keeps people's information private, it has some evidence. I think if you introduce it in the right way and patients have the right expectation, it's used to augment or extend, it's not used to replace, I think that real world clinical experience is the most valuable thing. I think if anything, what we've learned is in the questions that we have to see how these things work naturalistically. And a research study is a good first step, but the real evidence is what happens when you take it out of these kind of highly controlled artificial environments where everyone complies. So I think it's the right time to carefully, for the right patients, kind of begin to introduce it and say, do you want to use it? Because I think people are finding it regardless. So we may as well kind of step into. So thank you guys.